In the heart of the galaxy, there was a place where the boundaries of time and space were not just abstract concepts, but tangible forces, bendable and manipulable by those who knew how to navigate them. And among those who had mastered this art was a human unlike any other Cassian Albrecht. A time traveler. A man who had transcended the limits of his own era and journeyed across the ages, walking through centuries like an invisible spectator, watching the rise and fall of civilizations, the weaving of destinies, and the delicate flow of history. For years, Cassian had wandered through time, never staying in one place for too long, always observing, never fully engaging. It was the only way he knew how to protect himself, to safeguard the knowledge he carried, the knowledge of the future. But even someone as experienced as Cassian couldn't predict what would happen when he encountered an alien historian, someone who would blur the line between the past, present, and future in ways he could never have anticipated. Her name was Serafina. An alien of extraordinary grace, a being from a species that existed across millennia, able to see time as a stream flowing in all directions. Her people were historians, archivists of existence, chroniclers of the infinite moments that made up the fabric of the universe. But Serafina was different from the others in her order. She had the unique ability to not only observe time, but to interact with it just enough to understand its nuances and secrets. While Cassian had learned to pass through time, she had learned to read it, to perceive its threads and currents like a master weaver. Their first meeting was not planned, nor was it something either of them could have anticipated. Cassian, in one of his many excursions, had found himself drawn to a time period that was unfamiliar even to him, a time where human civilization had yet to rise but the remnants of alien cultures had been left behind. It was a peculiar era, one in which time seemed to twist in strange ways, and the fabric of reality appeared more fragile than usual. He had no intention of becoming involved in it, merely a witness to its passing, but something or someone pulled him closer. It was in the ancient ruins of a long-dead civilization that he first saw her. She stood alone amidst the crumbling remnants of what had once been a city, her golden skin reflecting the light of a distant sun. Her eyes, wide and knowing, flicked toward him as though she had known he was there all along, though Cassian had made no sound in his approach. She wasn't human, that much was clear, but something about her presence felt familiar. Something about the way she stood, poised and yet utterly untouchable, made him feel as if he had always known her, though they had never met. Serafina's gaze lingered on him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she spoke. "You've come from another time," she said, her voice soft but clear, echoing through the ruins. "I can feel it. You do not belong here." Cassian froze, surprised not only by her words, but by the deep understanding in her voice. Few could sense the presence of a time traveler, fewer still could pinpoint the moment they arrived. But Serafina was no ordinary historian. She understood time in ways that transcended the limitations of his own understanding. He had always prided himself on being the only one who could navigate the stream of history, the only one who could step between its currents. Yet, here was someone who seemed to exist outside of it, someone who could bend the flow of time without ever disturbing its course. "I could say the same about you," Cassian replied cautiously, unsure of how to engage with her. "You don't appear to belong to this era either." A knowing smile flickered on her lips, a smile that hinted at secrets yet to be revealed. "I belong everywhere and nowhere," she said. "I am a historian of time. I live between the moments, not bound to any one period." Cassian's curiosity was piqued. He had met many beings in his travels, but none quite like her. And there was something about her, something undeniable, that made him want to stay. The words she spoke were cryptic, but they hinted at knowledge far beyond his own. "You are not like the others," he said slowly, stepping closer, careful not to break the delicate atmosphere that seemed to wrap itself around them. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes tracing the lines of his face as if she were memorizing his every feature. "And you," she replied, her voice softer now, "are not like any human I have encountered." Cassian couldn't help but feel a tug of intrigue, and something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time, an inexplicable pull, a magnetic force that seemed to draw him closer to her. He had learned long ago not to get emotionally involved with anyone during his time travels. He could not afford to form attachments. His presence in the past or future was always fleeting. But Serafina was different. She wasn't merely a part of history, she was a part of the very fabric of time itself, an entity who transcended it in ways that made him feel small, yet inexplicably connected to her. Over the course of several days, Cassian and Serafina met in the ruins, sharing brief conversations about time, about history, and about the nature of existence. Serafina spoke of the vastness of time, how she could see its threads weaving together and unraveling, creating the intricate patterns of destiny. She spoke of her people, how they had learned to witness history without interfering, observing the ebb and flow of events without altering their course. But even as she spoke, there was a sadness in her eyes, a melancholy that spoke of the cost of her existence. To be a historian of time was to be eternally removed from it, unable to touch the lives of those she studied. For Cassian, it was different. He had always been a traveler, a participant in the flow of time. His role was not to observe, but to live through the ages, to experience history firsthand. And yet, here, with Serafina, he felt as though he were caught between two worlds, one where he was a fleeting traveler and the other where he was a part of something greater, something timeless. It was impossible to ignore the chemistry that existed between them, the undeniable attraction that simmered beneath their conversations. But neither of them spoke of it. Cassian was aware of the danger of forming such an attachment. He knew the rules. Time was not meant to be meddled with. To love someone from another era, someone who could not truly exist in his time, was a violation of the very essence of what he had sworn to protect. And Serafina was bound to the flow of history in ways that he could never fully understand. She was not meant to interact with him in any meaningful way. But as the days turned into weeks, the moments they shared became more intense, more profound. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of the depth of what was happening. They had crossed paths in the vastness of time, and in that brief intersection, they had found something extraordinary. One night, as they stood beneath the stars in the ancient city, the air thick with the weight of the past, Serafina turned to Cassian. Her eyes were filled with an emotion that she had never expressed before, something raw and vulnerable. "I can't help but wonder," she said softly, her voice trembling with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel, "what it would be like, just for a moment, to live outside of time. To experience it like you do." Cassian reached out, his hand brushing against hers. He didn't speak at first, unable to find the words. But in that touch, they both understood. It was impossible for them to truly be together, not in the way they both wanted. He could not stay in her time, and she could not leave hers. They were two beings, bound to different eras, different timelines. Their love was a fleeting moment, a beautiful but doomed encounter that would pass with the turning of the seasons. But in that moment, time seemed to stand still. For a brief, impossible instant, they were not a time traveler and a historian, they were simply two souls, connected by something beyond time, beyond the rules that governed their existence. "You can't stay," Serafina whispered, her voice full of sadness. "And I can't leave. But in this moment, I wish we could." Cassian leaned in, his lips meeting hers, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. There were no timelines, no eras, no constraints. There was only the heat of their kiss, the pulse of their connection. And in that fleeting moment, they were not separated by time. They were simply together. But as quickly as it had come, the moment ended. Cassian pulled away, his heart heavy with the realization of the impossibility of their love. He could not stay. He could not linger in this place, in this moment. His purpose was to keep moving, to remain a traveler in the ever-shifting currents of time. "I have to go," he said, his voice tight with emotion. Serafina nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know." And with that, Cassian turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the ruins, the silence of the ages wrapping around her once more. But even as he disappeared into the folds of time, he carried with him the memory of that fleeting kiss, of the love that had blossomed between them for the briefest of moments. And though they would never meet again, that love would remain with him, an unspoken bond that transcended the limits of time itself. For Serafina, time moved on as it always did, but she would never forget the human traveler who had crossed her path, who had shown her what it meant to live outside of the timelines. And in the quiet moments of her existence, when she allowed herself to feel, she would remember him, and the love they had shared across different timelines, a love that, like time itself, could never truly be contained.